On today's video, what I'm going to attempt to do is to put together the ancient history of the peninsula of Korea and the ancient history and some of the medieval history of the island chain of Japan. Um, at very best, this is going to be a challenge because there's so much information. And they're both very rich culturally. They have a lot of things that I would love to mention. But I've got to keep the video long enough so that people will stay tuned. Just please keep in mind, this is in class. Again, I've said this several times. This will be a long time in class. We talk about this for weeks. So let's dive in first. We'll just take it a step at a time. Let's look at Korea. The peninsula of Korea is on the far eastern edge of the continent of Asia. And I don't know if it's complimentary or polite to mention it like right off the go, but the Korean peninsula has for most of its existence, especially in ancient history, for most of its existence in my time period of history, been regarded as a bridge. Korea is often seen as a bridge between China and Japan. There are distinct people, though. There are evidences the archaeologists have found of settlements all the way back to the 2000s BC of people who had migrated in from northern and central Asia to the Korean peninsula. The first somewhat historical and modern records that we have of Korea asserting itself as a place in the early 200s BC. The Korean peninsula is invaded by China. Now, this is going to happen a lot. Korea is going to be invaded quite a few times. But in the early 200s BC, Korea is invaded by China. And in the 100s BC, the Koreans band together and expelled the invaders. And this is really the first expression of a modern Korean peninsula as far as a government and an identity historically that our textbook looks at. From 300 AD to 700 AD, there's a period of time that historians call the period of the Three Kingdoms. And so in Korea, from 300 AD to 700 AD, they're going to be the peninsula is going to be divided up into three kingdoms: the Koryo, the Silla, and the Pakchak. And now the Koryo are going to be closest resembling China in their culture and in their government model, and the Silla will be, because of their proximity to the island chain of Japan, will be closer aligned culturally with Japan. But those are your three kingdoms. The first kingdom that will conquer all of the Korean peninsula during the period of the three kingdoms will be the Silla. In the 660s BC, they will be the very first to subdue both of the other kingdoms, secure against invaders. They will have a central government. They will begin taxation. They will begin irrigation projects. And the Silla will run very, very close to a Chinese governmental model. A lot of influences from the Chinese. And then in 935 AD, the Silla, who have weakened over a period of time, as all dynasties do, will lose to a coup attempt and a takeover by the kingdom from the north. And it is from this kingdom from the north where the Koreans get their Koryo, where they get their modern name Korea. This will be a centralization that will take place. And so this new dynasty that will be formed in 935 AD will basically bring in what we understand as modern Korea. Korea's history is very, very rich. There's a lot of bronze work. There are influences, especially from China. The Buddhist influence is very, very powerful. Early in Korean history, shamanism, or the belief in a person who stands as a bridge between people and the spirit world, will dominate the religious life of the early Koreans. And there's a mixture of Buddhism and shamanism that will sort of create this tapestry in Korean religion, even up to the Koryo. Then there are invasions. And as I said, whether it's flattering or not, Korea has often been treated by others as a bridge between China and Japan. In 592 AD, you have the first of these situations where the Mongols, who have invaded China, will invade Korea, enslave many of the people, and force them to produce boats, and they were going to use these boats to invade Japan. The Koreans will eventually take advantage of the weakened Mongol state after the death of some stronger leaders and will expel them. Then they are invaded by the Japanese, and the Japanese who are trying to invade China. They will fight off the Japanese, and in the early 1600s AD, the Chinese will invade, and the Chinese will actually invade, conquer, and stay for a while. When they are finally expelled by the Korean people, that created a tension that existed for centuries. The Koreans and the Chinese did not get along for a very, very long time. But the Korean people they're distinct from the Chinese and the Japanese. You can see it in their bronze work, you can see it in their religion. And if you really want to see something interesting, go to page 515 in the textbook and look at a typical Korean warship. Because of their proximity to Japan, who generally kept a pretty strong navy, and China, who had a period of time where their navy, they had floating fortresses that were amazing. The Koreans came up with a very interesting warship model. They were called turtles. Don't let the name fool you. The idea is you take a warship and you ironclad it with scales of iron. Some of them actually, and the picture on 515 is one of these, some of them actually had bronze dragon heads, and out of the dragon's head would fire cannon fire or flames. I don't think it was quite Greek fire, but it was a pretty scary looking thing to see a fleet of these ironclad turtles, which sound so innocent, but these were scary ships. But the Koreans were very interesting people. Again, a bridge between China and Japan. Period of the Three Kingdoms from 300 to 700 BC. The Silla rule first, then the Koryo, and that's where we get the name Korea. And they are invaded by the Mongols, and then the Japanese, and then the Chinese. They do eventually expel these invaders, but it causes a lot of stress in the region. And that brings us to Japan. A lot of students enjoy studying Japan. Japan is a fascinating culture to learn about. I'm going to do the very, very best I can in the short amount of time that I have to try to explain in sort of overgeneralized terms a little bit about the Japanese culture. Now, you can go all the way back. So let's start with the geography. If Korea is a peninsula, which it is, and that's the dominant part of their geography, Japan is an archipelago. Japan is a chain of islands, which are actually mountains that rise from the seafloor. The histories of the early Japanese people are complex. They're just a lot like China, just like there's a lot of legends and myths about who were the first Chinese, the Shai. Were there really the Shai? There are people who the Japanese will refer to as the Yayoi, who will be the first rulers of a Japan that is being brought together. It is during this time where you have bronze work into iron, where you have farming of rice, where you have a form of central government. The Yayoi will give way to the Yamato. Now, the Yamato are going to be one of the longest lived dynasties in Japanese history. And it is the Yamato with their rises, there are good things that happen, and then there are bad things that happen. which are in, you see these inevitably with all empires and dynasties rather. The Chinese, the way they handle things is going to be a little bit different. And so what I want to try to do is I want to try to explain. When the Yamato come on the scene in the 500s AD, they will make their capital in the city of Nara, Nara. They will be influenced heavily by China. There's Chinese architecture, there's Chinese religion with the Buddhism. The indigenous Chinese religion is going to be a sort of animism, where everything has spirits. And the name of this is Shinto. And so a melding of Buddhism and Shinto will create the religious framework for early China. But the Yamato rule from Nara for quite a couple of centuries, quite a long time. In the 700s, the late 700s AD, a Buddhist monk will attempt to take over Nara, will attempt to take out the emperor and become emperor of China. This will cause the royal family to react, and what they do, this is where we kind of turn the page and everything becomes very Japanese. The emperor, the Yamato emperor, flees from Nara to Kyoto, the city of Kyoto. And from the 800s AD on, the emperors begin to lose their effectiveness. They begin to lose their power. Now, because you have weak leaders, and a couple of times in there were very young leaders, and if you have a very young emperor, 8, 9 years old, you'll have a regent to rule for that person until they get old enough to rule. Because of this, there were nobles who were in provinces on islands in Japan, far off from the capital of Kyoto. They will begin to seize power from area nobles who are loyal to the emperor. And the emperors, several of them, saw this. They knew what was going on, but they simply were too weak militarily and politically to crush these uprisings. And so what they did is, in a way, they kind of gave in to these nobles in these far off areas from the capital. And they made them a deal. So, okay, look, we'll let you have these lands, and you can rule them, and you can tax them, and you can take care of the people, but you have to support me, the emperor of Japan, politically. These nobles thought this was a pretty good arrangement, and they said yes. And one of the first things they did, and here comes one of the terms that a lot of students might be familiar with, one of the first things that these nobles did in these outlying areas, who now were in charge of these areas with the emperor's permission, one of the first things they did is they gave land to warriors who agreed to help them keep the peace and would fight for them. These warriors are the samurai. The word samurai means to serve. And it is not accurate to think of them as Japanese knights. They're a different critter. But it's going to sound a little bit like that because they're given land, even though they won't be really regarded as minor nobles like knights were. Because samurai don't respect merchants. They don't like the idea of monetary gain. What they respect is Bushido. This is the code, the military code of honor that samurais live by. They were horseback warriors. They used bows and arrows, swords and daggers, and the code of Bushido required them to be loyal to their noble masters, to always act honorably, and to never surrender in a fight. They would rather die in battle than to surrender. So these are the samurai. Obviously, if you have these nobles who have these samurai warriors who are essentially making up private armies that didn't belong to the emperor, eventually you're going to have a problem. In the 1100s AD, you have one of the strangest events, not just in Japanese history, but in all of history. These nobles with their samurai had gotten so powerful that there was a civil war in Japan. that the emperor was not invited to. The emperor of the emperor of Japan was not involved in a civil war. It was between two of these warlords who had grown, these nobles who had grown so large with their samurai armies that they fought each other. The Yamato eventually win this civil war, and the emperor is freaked out. He is horrified. He has no idea what this means to him. He's afraid that the Yamato general is going to just march into Kyoto and take over. And so the emperor decides to act first, and he invites the Yamato general to the capital, where he offers him a new position. He makes up a brand new position, shogun. And the Yamato general is like, it's great. What's a shogun? Well, a shogun is a commander of all of the military in Japan. So the Yamato general thinks it over and he says, okay, sounds like a pretty good idea. And so what he does is he accepts the title and he goes to the city of Kamakura. And in Kamakura, he sets up a second capital. So you have the capital in Kyoto, and then you have the shogun capital in Kamakura. This government is called a shogunate because it's run by a shogun. The Kamakura shogunate, or the second capital's government run by the head of the Japanese military, is going to really have the power in Japan. And for 700 years, power shifts. It goes from the emperor in Kyoto to the shogunate. Now, the first shogunate is the Kamakura shogunate. These guys are pretty tough. They fight off 2 Mongol invasions in their run. Eventually, the Kamakura shogunate weakens, and there's another warlord who challenges the government in Kamakura, the Ashikaga. The Ashikaga win and establish the Ashikaga shogunate. So let me back up. Let's make sure we got what's going on here. The Yamato emperor is chilling in Nara. A Buddhist monk in 770 attempts to take out the emperor and take over. They move to Kyoto. In the 800s, the Japanese emperor's weak. Nobles start seizing power and acting like they're going to rebel. The emperor says, okay, you can have these lands if you support me. Those nobles say okie dokie, and they give land to samurai. These nobles with their samurai armies get very, very powerful. In the 1100s, they have a civil war without the emperor. Then the winner is offered the title of shogun. And shoguns will be the real power in Japan from then on, until the 1300s AD. The first shogunate is in the city of Kamakura. The second shogunate is the Ashikaga. Now, the Ashikaga, in the beginning, they beat the Kamakura shogunate. They were pretty tough. Eventually, they have weak leaders. And so, basically, what happened with the emperors and those nobles who got their samurai armies, happens to the Ashikaga shogunate. They're nobles, these warlords who become powerful, and the Ashikaga are not as strong as the Kamakura shogunate. They can't shut this down. And so these warlords under the Ashikaga get a new name, daimyo. Now the daimyo under the Ashikaga shogunate basically act like warlords, and eventually fighting between these daimyo and their samurai armies will tear what was left of the central government of Japan under the emperor apart. That takes us up to the 1300s AD. It's an absolutely fascinating way to handle the idea of weakening leaders and then weakening leaders. I want to review real quick because there's a lot of terms, a lot of information. Korea. Bridge between China and Japan. 3 kingdoms, 300 BC to 700 BC. The Silla rule first and the Koryo. That's where we get the name Korea. They're invaded by the Mongols, the Japanese, and then the Chinese. They're famous, and they do eventually expel all of them. They do beat all of them. And they're famous for their boats. Don't let the name turtle fool you. They're tougher than they look. And then Japan, an archipelago of islands, basically sea mountains. The Yayoi are the first people in Japan, and then the Yamato. Uh, the Yamato will have their capital in Nara. They'll move it to Kyoto after an attempt on the emperor's life. From there, the emperor's weakened. Then you have nobles who get samurai armies. Then you have a civil war. Then you have the winner of the civil war given the title of shogun. That's the second government in Japan where the real power is. The shogun will rule for 700 years. The first shogunate, or government of a shogun, the first shogunate, Kamakura. Second, Ashikaga. Under the Ashikaga, they're a little weaker than the Kamakura were. The daimyo rise up, and the warring armies of these daimyo, the samurai of the daimyo, eventually tear the central government of Japan apart. Looking forward to seeing you guys in the Zoom. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Email me or put a comment on Classroom, and I'll make sure that I answer you back. See you guys in the Zoom.